So, I don't necessarily have to go through the whole like philosophy of astrology spiel.
Yeah, right.
I'll leave it correct.
Sorry that other guy didn't come. I think he might have been a little overwhelmed, or
Maybe
I don't know
so.
what he was expecting, but
I know I jumped around a lot, but the philosophy of astrology issue is one that it has no limits. You know, you can talk about what's astrology for, what does the birth chart actually represent is a question that's constantly debated, you know. So, I mean, again, just to recap, I like to think that it's your innate set of predispositions for seeing the world. It's how you perceive the different areas of life, and we're going to get into that about each house. Each house represents a different context of life through which any planet that shows up there is most prominently expressed. You know, so if your Mars part of yourself is the warrior inside of you, it's the action-taking, assertive side of you, and if that is in the third house, Mars, I think that's what Mars looks like, then you're going to be you're going to be putting a lot of conscious, like ego energy into the area of communication and sibling rivalries, and you're going to put a lot of energy into deciding how it is you're going to say what you want to say, you know? Because Mars on its own is kind of an impulsive energy. It doesn't really think before it speaks on its own, or think before it acts on its own. The warrior just has to go into battle and do the thing, right? So this might indicate an area where you might be a little more impulsive. If, for example, Aries is in a more fiery sign, you know, like Aries or Scorpio or something. Not that Scorpio's fire sign, but you know what I mean. Yeah. Scorpio is like emotionally reactive, right? You know, instantaneous, like just like blah, you know. So anyway, yeah. I think the birth chart represents your innate set of proclivities and predispositions for reacting to certain kinds of things, and the better you know your birth chart, the better you can kind of reflect. You know, we can't help but to react to certain things in certain ways. But this gives us an understanding of that when it does happen, you know, and maybe in certain cases it can like curb your reactions, but it's more about like understanding the reactions internally rather than simply externalizing them unconsciously, you know. So the first thing we're going to talk about when it comes to the houses is again, something I mentioned last time, that signs and houses are not the same thing. A lot of people like to, if you go on YouTube and you want to look up, you know, Mars in Aries, for example, you might see some video titles that say Mars in Aries or the first house. So if this is not where you have Aries in your chart, if it's your chart that you're looking at, that video is not going to be super relevant to you, even if your Mars is in Aries, say up here in the 8th house. Very different area of life in the 8th house than in the first house. They're in fact hardly related at all, you know. So again, I just want to give that disclaimer and advise against watching videos, reading descriptions about, hello, how are you? Houses and astrology? Intro to astrology? Okay, cool. So what I'm talking about right now is to not marry the signs and the houses. If you go to YouTube and you want to look up Mars in Aries, all right? You'll see a lot of video titles that say Mars in Aries or the first house. So a lot of people like to associate the first house with Aries, the second house with Taurus, the third house with Gemini, so, it's Pisces sometime. So, Cancer. Yeah. Boop. I'm really good at drawing. I went to art school. So while there are overlapping traits and significations, we could say, between Aries and the first house, signs and houses are very different things. And we don't want to marry them. Gene, you're back. What's up, brother?
Hi.
Excuse me, I don't mean to interrupt, but
No worries.
I have to give someone a ride, not now, but maybe 20, 30 minutes.
Yeah. You can pop in, pop out.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay,
whatever you want,
Oh,
Gene.
you're
Yeah, you're one of the OGs. At this point, you're in.
Well, no, it's just like,
You have attended 100% of my lectures at Conway Library.
okay,
Oh my
well,
god.
So you're good. Yeah.
Yeah, we were,
This is only the second one. Yeah. So yeah, Gene, we're kind of recapping about that thing I mentioned last time about how you don't want to marry like Aries to the first house. A lot of times people say Aries and the first house are kind of the same thing, but Aries is a sign and the first house is a house. And so what the signs represent are styles of expression of any planet that is in that sign. Whereas a house is a context of life, an external set of circumstances and themes in which that planet is most prominently expressed. So if you have, let's say you do have. Let's get rid of signs right now. Let's say you have Mars here. This is the first house that deals with physical appearance and identity. Obviously, the warrior inside of you, which is what Mars represents, is going to be expressed very differently than if you have Mars in the fourth house, which is the area of home and what role you take inside of a home context, right? So the houses offer areas of life for those parts of you to be expressed, to be concerned with. It's basically about values, right? So an empty house means that you don't really place a lot of conscious emphasis on the things of that house. So if you have an empty second house is about money, finances, material grounding. It's about stuff, possessions, things that you buy with money, right? If you don't have any planets here in the second house, it means that you don't place a whole lot of value on material things, right? Not consciously anyway. But if in transit up in the sky, say Mars is, let's say you have, your first house is in Aries, your second house is in Taurus. Let's say Mars is entering Taurus. That means that in your chart, it's entering your second house. So you may feel an external pull, an external energy driving you toward attacking opportunities that will lead to financial gain or material possessions or something. You might be more inclined to go out clubbing, because Mars is also about sexual energy as well. So even if it's in Taurus, right? Because Taurus, we think of not a very club-going kind of energy, right? Because it's really chill, it's kind of grazing the field, wants to take it slow. But it's actually more important, if your second house is in Taurus, it's more important to consider that Mars would be going through your second house than it is that it's going into Taurus. There may be a sensual Taurian, sensual way that you dress or go about your pursuit of whatever it is you're pursuing at the club, But again, signs are about style of expression, not about the things themselves that you value. Those values come through in the houses. So I'm going to go through, take you on a journey through the houses. And we're going to talk about what each of the houses represents. Anything more I say? So one thing to keep in mind before I start writing I'm gonna write one word, what I think is the most like accurate, descriptive single word to encompass the things that each house represents. And I'm gonna explain why I use those words, and it might not be what you expect if you know anything about the houses, but yeah, we'll see. Again, views, information, or opinions expressed during this program are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of the city of Cottonwood or its employees. Or you know, feel free to ask questions for clarification at any point. So one concept to keep in mind is that of polarity when we're talking about these things. Every sign has an opposite, and likewise every house has an opposite, one that's 180 degrees across the chart. And these two areas of life represent things that are supposed to be perfect complements to each other. And if you place a lot of emphasis on one side and not on the other, what you're going to subconsciously attract is the stuff of the other side. So some people have a stellium in their 5th house, you know. 5th house is the fun house. It's about, you know, friendship, short-term flings and romance. It's about your relationship to kids, like how it is that you get along with kids. It's about fun, you know, and leisure and hobbies. And then right across is the house of belonging and greater contextual sense of belonging that you gain from social groups and what it is that you see your role is within the context of humanity. So if you place all your emphasis over here and none over here, you can end up being lost for purpose. You may have a lot of friends and acquaintances, but you may feel lost for purpose. Like, what's my actual role in the social world? So keep in mind polarity, self, other people, you know? So I want to draw out, before we get started with that, and I did this last time, bottom half of the chart is kind of the inward, internal world. And then the top of the chart is outer facing. Left side of the chart is self. And right side of the chart is others. So this is one of the reasons I like quadrant house systems, is because you have concepts like this and hard lines dividing what they mean, you know? So we'll just keep that in mind for now. But we'll start on the first. So the houses are, a chart is represented in a wheel for a reason, all right? There's an evolutionary relationship that each of the houses have toward each other, and each one kind of evolves out of the one before it. So first house is identity, and the second house is material. So identity is kind of an abstract concept. Who are we? What are we, right? In some ways it's represented by our physical appearance and how we dress and our style and stuff. And that's what the AC represents, the ascendant. So, or your rising sign, as it's also called, ascendant rising sign. Let's see,
Is that permanent or does that change? Does that move?
equals rising. So everybody has a fixed rising sign in their birth chart, but it is the fastest moving placement of any that we look at in a birth chart. It changes every 2 hours. So that's why it's really important to have your birth time right. If you're just a few minutes off even, and say you think you're a Taurus rising, but you're on like the 29th degree of Taurus, you're right at the end of Taurus. If your birth time is even like 2 minutes off, that could push you into the next sign, into Gemini, if it's 2 minutes later. So it's really important to have your birth time because that kind of aligns how the signs and the houses sort of line up. But we'll get there. So yeah, the rising sign changes every 2 hours. You go through the entire cycle of rising signs over the course of a 24-hour period. So your rising signs, arguably, and I could do a whole talk on the rising sign, is arguably just as important as your sun and your moon. I would argue in certain cases it's more important because if you have Taurus rising right here, that means that your first house is going to be in Taurus, and your second house is going to be in Gemini, and your third house is going to be in Cancer, and so on and so forth. And you're going to have a different relationship with these different areas of life that each house represents. You're going to see them differently, right? So whatever sign you have on the cusp of the first house, the ascendant is the cusp of the first house. That's going to be your perspective, the style in which you see things related to your identity. How you dress, how you present yourself, how it is that you are before you break the ice with people. That's what the ascendant or the rising sign represents, as your style of expression without really thinking about it. You enter a party, you read the room with your rising sign, and people read you from a distance via your rising sign. So it's an unconscious kind of personality. I talked last week about like how I'm a Capricorn rising, right? So I wear like really neutral, like kind of dark colors or whatever. These kinds of shoes, that I've had since 8th grade. These are my Capricorn rising shoes. They're really reliable, and that's the kind of thing that Capricorn is concerned with, is reliability and conservation and things that last. They want things to last, so they're conserving for the future. They're trying to extract as much value out of one little thing, every little thing as possible, So I've extracted a lot of value out of these. I've had them over half of my life, and they're not, they're not very solid, but they go with everything. Badly, but they go with everything, So anyway, I want to put signs away for a second. The first house is about identity and your relationship to your appearance. And so any planets that you have in the first house make you very self-concerned. If you have your sun here, if your sun is in the first house, you typically are going to be a very sort of self-centered person, because the sun is the center of the solar system, and everything revolves, orbits around it, and the sun represents the ego. And the first house, the area in which your ego is concerned, is about the self and your identity. So it follows that a lot of your energy is going to be put toward things regarding your physical appearance and how you see yourself and how you understand yourself as an individual separate from other individuals. So I like to think of the houses as kind of like the different phases of life from 1 to 12. So it's like a baby comes out, rises, right? Rising sign, rises from the underworld of the womb into physical space. And it's first like coming into itself and discovering its identity. Not that it's like getting to know all the nuances of its personality, becoming fully self-aware, but it's gaining self-awareness, awareness of the fact that it is a thing that is separate from other things, right? And then the first house evolves into the second house, which is about material, money, material security. And a baby needs to have security, right right as it's, starting to develop and live its life. But it's sort of like the second conscious concern. A baby comes out, discovers that it's something different from everything else, and then it starts to cry, right? And so what it needs when it's crying is material comforts and security. Food, water, shelter. Oh, it's hot, it's cold, it needs a blanket, needs rest, it's tired, I say it because we don't know what kind of baby we're dealing with right now, just a hypothetical baby. But it needs material things to survive, so it's sort of the survival area of life. So anyone who has planets in the second house, let's say the sun, because it's the easiest, example, that person's going to be concerned with providing for itself, right? Has a sense of itself. That evolves into the material world of providing for itself. So it's going to put a lot of conscious sun ego energy into things of the material space. Physical stuff, possessions, making money, like not really in a career sense, that's more 10th house, but more so in a sense of like, what do I have to do to survive? I have to make money. So it's concerned with making money for its own sake. Yeah. So, material. Third, is about learning. You hear the word communication a lot in third house, and you have to communicate and be communicated with in order to learn. So I think, but learning encompasses a lot more than just communication, right? It's also the house of siblings. So your siblings are important for your learning and development process, right? Okay, so you have the material things your parents are providing for you as a baby, and then you have like a sibling who's around your age, right? So you learn communication and develop some social skills, like learn how to deal with conflict and things like that with your sibling, right? So siblings are thrown into the area of learning and the area of communication, because you actually develop your communication skills and your social skills at the exact same time in life and at the exact same rate. And they work together, It's not just siblings, but it's maybe any cousins that you have around that are around your age, any peers, like early childhood peers in the neighborhood or at preschool especially. Those crucial development, that period up to like age 5 or 6, where if you don't have a native language being triggered in your brain and being expressed and developed by that time, you're a goner. There's no fully developing a language unless you kind of trigger that ability in your brain before age 5. And it's the same thing with general social cues, like being able to understand and pick up on social cues from your peers, how to read emotions through the eyes, how to communicate in a nonverbal way as much as in a verbal way. And so your siblings and any other kids in your peer group who you have around are very important for those development phases. So third house is about learning, and it's about learning like isolated facts as well. It's your relationship with learning about stuff. Not really about connecting dots. It's not about bigger concepts. That comes about in another house, as you'll see. But it's about information. So if you have like your third house cusp is in Virgo, then you have a very meticulous way of processing and learning information. It's very detailed. It's very like 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, rather than 7. It's about learning the parts rather than the whole, Learning mechanistic inner workings. People who are really good at IT and technology and stuff typically have stuff going on in the third house, because it's about like isolating information from other information. And then there's usually a balance there with the ninth house, which we'll get to, which is more about connecting dots. But again, you need balance between opposites, right? Or else if you weigh too heavily on one thing, then the opposite is going to unconsciously haunt you, you know?
Yeah.
So, third house is about learning. Fourth house, yeah, I was like rethinking this one the other day, so I wanted to make sure. Fourth house is about home. And so once you've been a little kid, like a toddler, and you've gotten into some fights with your siblings or cousins or kids on the playground, and you've learned some stuff about, you know, how to deal with isolated problems and information and speech, then you start to develop a role within the home. All right, so the fourth house is about home life. Any planets that you have here, if you have the sun here, for example, you're going to be very concerned, consciously energy gauging toward home life and building a foundation. So a kid, you know, a kid goes to school, maybe, I don't know what's going on nowadays. They kind of like figure out what their role is, you know, at that stage. Like, okay, I'm a kid, like I go to school and I do work at school, and my parents are my parents and my siblings are my siblings. And then like I come home from work, school, right? And they go outside and play in the fifth house. Like, what else am I apart from the role I serve in the home as being subservient to my parents and you know, a pain in the arse for my older sister or something. The fifth house is the house of creativity. It's about expression. It's about leisure and hobbies, things that you like. It's preferences, likes and dislikes. Not in the same way as the second house. Second house is about likes and dislikes when it comes to like physical stuff. It's more about like your taste in food and wine, right? Not that kids should be drinking wine, that's not what I'm getting at, you know, overlapping concepts here. It's about like your reaction, more about your physical reaction to stuff. You know, oh, I like it right away, or I dislike it right away. That's the second house. But the fifth house is like, why do I like this? What about it like resonates with my personality, you know? So fifth house things are kind of more developed as you get into, you know, teenage years, right? Like preteen, teenage years, you really start to get a sense of how to express yourself in an organic fashion, and the things that you like or dislike that more resonate with you as a deeper person rather than just on a surface like physical reaction level, you know, physical reaction, second house. It's more about personality expression in the fifth house, you know. So again, all of this stuff that we're talking about, we're about to get to the last house in the bottom of the chart. Remember, the bottom of the chart is sort of the inward self. Like, we're still trying to understand ourselves here in the bottom of the chart. And so it's about introspection. You know, if your chart has most of its planets or all of its planets in the bottom half, you're likely to be more introverted, right? Because it's below the horizon. You're likely to be more of a night person, actually. Because this is you in the center, right here. Boop. You. And imagine that, you know, this is your chart and your face is pointing outward like this, right? This is the eastern horizon. That's the western horizon. And then above is daytime, below is nighttime. So the midheaven represents the highest point in the sky at the time of your birth. So this is really about like getting to know ourselves, our reactions to things, our preferences, stuff like that. And also in the sixth house, our work ethic and our sense of, what's the word? Responsibility. So by the way, if your sun is in the fifth house, for example, I know I've been using that as the example for house placements, because most people are familiar with what the sun represents, right? Where you exert your energy, where you feel comfortable being yourself, where you don't feel much restraint, you know. Your sun is expressive in the area in which it shows up. But if it's in like an introverted house, a lower hemisphere house, your sun is in a sort of introverted position. Even if it's in a sign like Aries, which is very exerting of its energy and is full of like physical energy, has to storm around the block anytime it throws a tantrum, you know, and just like cool off. But it cools off just as quickly as it flares up, right? Aries. They're still going to be concerned with whatever the theme of whatever house that sun falls in, you know? That's not something that you can really control. This is a little bit of philosophy of the houses real quick. You can't control which area of life you value most. And that's what's represented by the houses and whichever planets you have in those houses. What do you value? And if you don't have a planet in a particular house, it means you don't put a lot of conscious effort into that area of life. You don't really value it that much, you know? Like, I don't have anything in my second house in my birth chart, so I'm not concerned with making money. That's why I give away free education like this, you know? But I feel a great duty and responsibility to give away what I know.
Wow.
That's because my sun is in the sixth house. So it's your sense of duty and responsibility toward whatever task you take on, all right? And which task you're going to take on is going to depend on where your other planets are. Your Venus gives you a sense of what you like, you know? So if your sun is in the fifth house, you're going to be more performance-oriented. You know, you're going to be more of a performer. Your energy is going to go toward expressing yourself, whatever that means, through art or music or whatever. But if your sun is in the sixth house, you know, and your Venus is in the fifth house, Venus represents